Ever feel like you're living in a simulation? Like what we call reality is just our brain's best guess at what's out there.
Yeah. It's a question that's fascinated people forever.
I mean, not in some sci-fi matrix way,
Right, right.
but more like how much of this is actually just happening inside our heads?
Totally. And new research is starting to give us some seriously mind-bending answers. One of the wildest ideas is that consciousness itself, basically, is a kind of reality simulation. It's how our brains make sense of the world so we can actually function.
A reality simulation. Okay. I got to know more. How does that even work?
Well, think of your brain like a supercomputer, right?
Yeah.
And it's just constantly flooded with data, like sights and sounds, touch, smells, everything.
Right.
It's got to process it all in real time to make
Uh-huh.
decisions, figure out what's going to happen next, basically just to survive.
So our brain creates this simulation to kind of cut corners,
Yeah.
like a more efficient way to handle all that information.
Exactly. It's like a VR program, not the real world, but close enough so we can interact with our environment, do stuff.
Yeah, that's a pretty trippy concept. So what's this simulation actually made of? Like, what are the building blocks?
Primarily, it seems to be built on visual input. Our brains create this virtual model of the outside world, and even our own bodies within that world, mainly based on what we see.
So basically, our sense of sight is like the foundation for this whole simulated reality.
It seems to be a key part, yeah. And there's research showing that this visual model might actually be located in specific parts of the brain.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Scientists have noticed that in certain areas, the neurons are firing steadily when our eyes are making those small movements, like when we read.
Okay.
But when that visual input gets disrupted, say if you press on your eyeball,
Okay.
the activity in those areas goes haywire, totally changes.
So our brain is constantly updating this visual model with new information from our eyes.
Yeah.
But whereabouts is this all happening? Like, what parts of the brain are we talking about?
Well, it's complicated, a whole network. But some of the main players seem to be the inferotemporal cortex, recognize objects, faces especially. Then there's the superior temporal sulcus, and that one's all about perceiving movement, how living things move.
So like those areas are building that sense of seeing the world around us and understanding how things are moving in that world.
That's the current thinking. Then you've got areas like the fusiform gyrus. That one helps us recognize individual faces. And parts of the parietal and frontal lobes are involved. Those handle spatial awareness and planning actions.
It's wild to think about all this happening behind the scenes, constantly shaping our experience of reality.
Mm.
But where does the self fit into this?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Like if our brain's creating this simulation, who's the I experiencing it all?
Right. One way to think about it is that consciousness, the stuff we experience, it's like the final website you see.
Mhm.
All the code, the databases, all that complex stuff is running in the background.
Mhm.
But you only see the finished product, the web page.
I like that. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So all this brain activity, this creation of a simulated reality, it's all happening below our awareness. And then consciousness emerges as the final product, the experience of being in that world.
Exactly. And this leads to some crazy questions about what the self even is.
Okay, like what?
Well, if consciousness is just the outcome of these brain processes, could you copy it? Like if we could perfectly map out someone's brain, all the connections and pathways,
Hmm.
would that create a copy of their consciousness?
Whoa, now that's getting into sci-fi territory.
Mm.
But it raises a big philosophical question, like if you can duplicate consciousness, does that make it less valuable, less meaningful?
Right. That's worth thinking about. If consciousness is just a product of physical stuff, then in theory, yeah, you could copy it. But does that mean the individual's experiences, their memories, are less significant? Or is there something special about the original, something a copy could never truly capture?
Wow, okay. Lots to unpack there. But before we get too deep into that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
let's go back to how this sense of self, this conscious experience, how does it actually happen? There are a few different ideas about that, right?
There are, yeah. And some are pretty fascinating. One theory says consciousness comes from feedback loops inside our sensory neurons. Basically, these neurons send signals back to themselves, but with a tiny delay.
So it's like our brain is talking to itself.
Kind of, yeah. And this back and forth, this loop of signals referring back to themselves, could be what creates that I know feeling, that sense of awareness we experience as consciousness.
Okay, so it's not just that we see something, it's that we're aware that we are seeing it. That's pretty mind-blowing. But does this theory explain everything about consciousness?
It's part of the puzzle, but it doesn't fully answer what's often called the hard problem of consciousness. Like, we can see these neural processes happening, the feedback loops, but why do they result in subjective experience? Why does it feel like something to be us?
Right. It's one thing to know the mechanics of how the brain processes information, but it's something else entirely to explain why that processing feels like something, why it creates that feeling of what it's like to be conscious.
Exactly. And while we may not have that answer yet, there are some strong arguments that consciousness is fundamentally tied to what's happening physically in the brain.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about these arguments.
One idea focuses on the very act of talking, of speech. Think about it.
Okay,
We only ever talk about things we're conscious of.
that's true.
We're linking this physical act, making sounds, to our inner world, thoughts and feelings. It suggests that consciousness itself has to be rooted in the physical stuff of the brain.
So because we can use language to express what we're experiencing inside, it implies that those experiences have a physical basis. They're not just floating around out there.
Yeah, exactly. It's not separate, not some ethereal thing. It's more like consciousness is a property that emerges from these incredibly intricate networks of neurons.
But how do we get from, like, neurons firing to the feeling of red or the joy of listening to music? There's still this gap between the physical stuff and what it feels like subjectively.
It's definitely a tough one, but think of it this way. Our brains are constantly taking in these sensory signals, comparing them to memories, and trying to make sense of it all, like all the time.
Right.
This constant process of understanding information, that might be the core of what consciousness is.
So it's not just about getting the information, it's about actively working with it, making meaning out of the sensory data.
Exactly. And without memory, we wouldn't have anything to compare the new information to. Our experience would probably be totally different.
This makes me wonder about animals. Like, if memory is so important for consciousness, do animals with less developed memory systems, do they have a different kind of awareness? Do they experience reality in a less complex way?
It's a great question. Some researchers think there might be different levels of consciousness,
Hmm?
like a basic experiencing self that lots of animals have. This would be a fundamental awareness, just sensations and emotions.
So like a dog feeling the sun on its fur, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe a dog isn't having the same self-reflection or complex thoughts like humans do,
Right.
but they're still having an inner experience of the world.
An inner world. That's interesting.
Yeah. And then on top of that, us humans, we might have developed this thinking self. That's the part of us using language, reasoning, reflecting on our own experiences.
So there's this basic animal awareness that we share, and then humans added on this whole extra layer of introspection, thinking about our own thinking. Like our consciousness is multi-layered, built on these different levels of experience.
It's a fascinating concept, but even with this layered model, we're still figuring out how those subjective experiences come from physical processes.
It seems like the more we learn about the brain, the deeper the mystery gets.
Huh.
But let's shift gears a bit. We've been talking about how consciousness works, but I'm curious about what are the characteristics, what makes conscious experience so unique?
Great question. There are a few things that really set it apart from other ways our brains process information. For example, we're wired for what's called gestalt formation.
Okay.
We automatically try to make meaningful patterns, wholes, out of all the sensory bits and pieces we're getting.
Like seeing a face in a cloud,
Yeah,
or hearing a melody in random beeps.
exactly. Then there's the infinite variety of stuff we experience consciously. It's always changing, adapting to new information and input.
Right. No two moments are ever exactly the same.
Right. Our minds are constantly buzzing with thoughts, feelings, perceptions. It's this constant flow, never still.
True. It never stops. There's always something going on in there.
And this flow is unpredictable too. You don't know what thought or feeling is going to pop up next. Keeps things interesting.
Makes meditation a bit of a challenge, that's for sure. But speaking of unpredictability, doesn't that also make our conscious experience really informative?
How so?
Well, our brains are always filtering, picking out what's important, and the things that are new or unexpected, those are the things we notice.
Right.
Things that are constant or predictable, they just fade into the background.
Absolutely. We'd be totally overloaded if we were aware of every single detail all the time.
So it's like our brains are master editors, deciding what makes it into our conscious experience, highlighting what's most interesting or important right now.
A perfect analogy. And that leads to another feature, how fleeting it all is. We're only truly focused on this moment. Each perception, each thought, it's there for a few seconds, then gone, replaced by the next one.
It's like a constant stream, always flowing, never stopping.
Precisely. But even though it's changing all the time, there's also this internal consistency. Our experience, even with all the variety, it somehow stays coherent.
Okay.
They don't just jump between totally unrelated thoughts, even if it feels like that sometimes.
So there's a logic to it, a thread running through our experience.
Exactly. And this consistency is tied to how consciousness unfolds in a sequence, one thing after another. We can't really hold on to multiple complex thoughts or perceptions all at once.
Right? Like trying to follow two conversations at the same time, it's just not possible.
Exactly. This limited capacity of our awareness, it points to another key feature. We can report on it. We can communicate our experiences, describe thoughts and feelings through language, writing, even just our body language.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to report on what's happening inside, that's a real hallmark of conscious experience.
So it makes us human, right? Being
Yeah.
able to share our thoughts, connect with others on that level.
It definitely plays a big part in how we interact and understand ourselves. So we've got the stream of consciousness, always updating, limited in capacity, but full of detail. What else?
Sounds about right. What else comes to mind?
Two more big ones: memorability and stability. We can remember stuff, bring past experiences back into awareness, even though they're not happening right now. And this ability to recall, to reflect on the past, it shapes who we are, our personal history.
So memory is like a bridge between our past and present self.
Exactly. And then there's stability. Despite all the change, all the variety, there's a core me that persists. Our experience is anchored to this sense of self, even as the content of our awareness is always shifting.
So even though we're changing all the time, there's this fundamental me-ness that stays constant.
It seems that way, and it's the stability, this persistent self, that makes life feel like a journey, a continuous one, rather than just disconnected moments.
Wow. When you lay it all out like that, it's amazing how much is packed into this thing we call consciousness.
Yeah.
But there's one thing you mentioned earlier about the brain building this visual model of the world. And there was a point that really stuck with me.
Oh, where was that?
It was about how we go from just processing the basic visual stuff to actually recognizing things.
Okay.
You even asked, is it really seeing if it's just happening in those early visual parts of the brain, like the LGN or V1?
Hmm.
Or do we only really see when those signals reach areas like the inferotemporal cortex, the medial temporal lobe, where those higher level gestalt representations are formed?
You're hitting on the difference between sensing and perceiving. We could be taking in all this raw sensory data without actually experiencing it consciously. It's only when the brain processes those signals, turns them into meaningful patterns, that we become aware of them.
So maybe those early visual areas are like the behind-the-scenes crew setting up the stage, and then the inferotemporal cortex, medial temporal lobe, they're like the directors, shaving the final cut of the movie we experience as seeing.
That's a great way to put it. It shows how consciousness isn't just passively taking in information, it's actively involved in shaping how we interpret the world around us.
Okay, I think I'm starting to wrap my head around all this, but one last question keeps bugging me. If we can make a perfect copy of my brain, would that copy be me? Or is there something more to consciousness, something that can't be copied?
Ugh, the age-old question of the soul: what makes you, you? It's puzzled people for centuries, and we may never have a definite answer. But here's something to consider. Think about how our sense of self is constantly being updated, like a backup system. Every time consciousness is interrupted, sleep, anesthesia, even a moment of distraction, it's like a reboot.
So we're not the same person we were a minute ago.
Not exactly. The you that wakes up is a continuation, but with slightly different starting conditions. New experiences, memories, they're integrated into the system, like a river. The water's always flowing, changing, but the riverbed stays the same.
So if consciousness is always evolving, this continuous flow, could we ever capture it in a static copy, even if we copied every neuron perfectly?
That's a question for you to ponder. Is there something unique about the original stream of consciousness, the lived experience, that a copy could never have? Or is the copy with the same structure, the same memories, essentially the same as the original?
Whoa, my brain is officially fried. I need to go lie down and process all this.
I think we both do. But that's what's so cool about these deep dives, isn't it? They challenge our thinking, make us see things in new ways, and leave us with more questions than answers.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe someday we'll have even more mind-blowing insights into what consciousness is, what the self really is. Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep diving deep.
Well said. And remember, the journey is just as important as the destination.
See you next time on The Deep Dive.